Imagine the world centuries ago, before the hum of electricity, before the constant motion of cars and screens, before the world became endlessly awake. Picture instead a quiet town in medieval Europe, where the night is not broken by artificial light, but only by the pale glow of the moon. The air is still, heavy with the faint smell of wood smoke and damp straw, and the silence is broken only by the occasional bark of a dog, or the distant toll of a church bell. It is here, in this place of shadows and stillness, that our story begins. Tonight, we are not rushing through history, nor chasing sharp details. Instead, we are moving slowly, as if walking by lantern light, tracing the faint outlines of the past. Our steps are soft, our path winding, and we linger with every image until it has fully taken shape in the mind. The figure we follow tonight is one that haunts both history and imagination, the plague doctor. When we hear the words, an image rises almost instantly of the long cloak, the wide-brimmed hat, and most of all, the strange mask with its curved beak. It looks almost like the face of a bird, yet it is human inside. A mixture of healer, guardian, and omen of death. But who truly was this figure? Was he the brave physician who stepped into danger when no one else would? Was he a charlatan, a pretender with little real knowledge? Or was he something stranger, a symbol, a character halfway between truth and myth? The reality is more complex than the simple image we often see on posters and costumes. The plague doctor did exist, but not always as we imagine him. His story stretches across centuries, woven with fear, misunderstanding, superstition, and fragments of real medicine. And so tonight, in this gentle unfolding tale, we will walk through that story. We will step first into the arrival of the plague itself, the great shadow that called this figure into being. Then, we will see how doctors were summoned to face it, how their role changed, and how the haunting mask became a symbol across Europe. This is not a tale to rush. It is a slow drifting journey, told in soft tones, a history not of dates and battles, but of feelings, of images, of a world once real and now half forgotten. Close your eyes, let the present world fall away, and follow me back into the time when silence ruled the streets. The arrival of the plague. Before the plague doctor, before the haunting mask and the dark robes, before the figure became a symbol of fear and mystery, there was first the plague itself, a sickness so vast, so devastating, that it changed the very course of history. Close your eyes for a moment, and let us drift back to the 14th century. Picture Europe as it was then, not the bustling continent we know now, but a patchwork of towns and villages, fields and forests, castles and churches, all bound together by roads of dirt and stone. Life was hard, but it was steady, familiar. Farmers tilled their lands by hand. Merchants carried goods along winding trade routes. Children played in muddy streets, chasing one another past stalls of bread and wool. Bells rang out from tall church towers, calling the faithful to prayer. It was a world alive with sound and movement, yet also a world of fragility. Harvests could fail. Winters could be cruel. Wars erupted without warning. Still, life went on, for people are resilient, and they have always endured. But then, something new arrived. Something they had never seen before. A sickness that traveled faster than armies, struck harder than famine, and lingered longer than any winter. It began far away, but like a storm gathering on the horizon, it crept closer and closer, until there was no safe corner left. The first whispers came by sea. Ships docked in Mediterranean ports, carrying silks, spices, and grains from distant lands. But among the barrels and bales of cargo, hidden in shadows, came stowaways, rats, scurrying along beams and ropes, their black eyes glinting in the dark. On their bodies clung tiny fleas, and inside those fleas stirred the invisible spark of the plague. No one knew this, of course. To them, it seemed as though sickness simply appeared. A merchant would fall ill after a voyage. A dock worker would collapse after unloading a ship. Families who had been laughing at supper one night would be weeping the next, their loved ones writhing in fever. At first, the signs were small: a headache, a fever, an aching in the limbs. But then came the swellings, the terrible marks that gave the disease its name, the buboes. They rose beneath the arms, along the neck, in the groin, great swollen lumps that burned with pain and fear. Dark blotches sometimes spread across the skin, bruises that seemed to appear without cause. The body weakened. Breathing grew shallow. And soon, the silence of death filled the household. Imagine the terror of it. One day your street is alive with voices, with children playing, with the chatter of markets. And the next, shutters are closed, doors are barred, and the only sound is the creak of a cart carrying the dead. A bell tolls in the distance, not once, not twice, but over and over, announcing loss upon loss. The people did not understand what was happening. In truth, even the wisest physicians of the age could not have explained it, for the knowledge of germs, of bacteria, of invisible causes, was still centuries away. Instead, people searched for meaning where they could find it. Some believed it was the wrath of God, punishment for sins too many to count. Others thought the air itself had turned poisonous, corrupted by strange movements of the planets or by foul winds drifting across the land. A few whispered of conspiracies that wells had been poisoned, that outsiders had brought the disease deliberately. Fear does strange things to people. In some towns, processions of flagellants wound their way through the streets, men and women beating themselves with whips in hopes that their suffering would appease the anger of heaven. In others, families locked themselves inside their homes, refusing to touch or even look upon their neighbors. Travelers were turned away at gates. Strangers were shunned, for who knew what sickness they carried in their breath, in their clothes, in their very presence. And still, the plague moved on. From Italy to France, from France to Spain, from the heart of Europe into its farthest edges, it spread. It followed trade routes, it traveled with soldiers, it rode on the backs of rats that skittered through every town and village. By the time it had passed, nearly half the population of Europe would lie dead. Whole villages vanished, left to crumble in silence. Fields went untended, their crops withering where they stood. Churches overflowed with the dead, until graves could hold no more. The world was changed forever. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, people searched for light. They prayed, they hoped, and they turned to those they believed could help them, their healers, their physicians, their doctors. But the doctors of the time were unprepared. They had no cures, no true understanding of what they faced. Still, they did what they could. They tried remedies passed down through generations: herbs, oils, vinegar, strong-smelling flowers pressed to the nose in the hope of warding off foul air. They lanced the buboes, drained them, believing it might release the sickness from the body. They bled their patients, following the old belief that illness came from imbalances in the humors of the body. Little of it worked, but they tried nonetheless. The work of these early plague doctors was grim. They walked into houses where whole families lay sick, the air heavy with fever and fear. They wrote down names, kept records, so that memory would not be lost even as lives slipped away. They touched the dying when no one else dared. And often, they too were claimed by the sickness, their service ending in the same silence as those they had tried to help. It was in this terrible time, and in the centuries that followed, that the role of the plague doctor began to take shape. At first, he was not the eerie bird-masked figure we imagine today. He was simply a physician, sometimes skilled, sometimes not, hired by towns to stay when others fled. But as the plague returned again and again, as waves of sickness swept across Europe in the centuries that followed, his image began to change. Later, in the 17th century, his costume would become iconic: the wide-brimmed hat, the long dark cloak, the strange mask with its curved beak. But here, in the 14th century, in the first great wave of the Black Death, he was still just a man with little power against the storm, but with the courage, or perhaps the obligation, to step into the darkness when others turned away. So picture him now, if you will. Not yet the figure of myth, but a tired physician, carrying a small satchel of herbs, walking slowly through a street that has grown too quiet. The windows are shuttered. The air is heavy. The only sound is the echo of his footsteps, and somewhere far off, the slow toll of the church bell. He does not know if he can help. He does not know if he will live. But still, he walks on. This is where the story of the plague doctor truly begins. The birth of the plague doctor. The memory of the Black Death lingered over Europe like a shadow that never lifted. Even when the first great wave had passed, when the church bells ceased their endless tolling, and when towns dared once more to open their gates, the people knew it would come again. And it did. Time and again, across the centuries, plague returned, sweeping into cities with the swiftness of a storm. It was in this world of repeated fear, where no town felt truly safe, that a new figure slowly emerged, a man unlike any other in the medieval imagination. He was neither knight nor priest, neither merchant nor farmer. He belonged to no guild of craftsmen and no noble house. Instead, he belonged to the sickness itself. This was the plague doctor. A profession born of necessity. The birth of the plague doctor was not an act of inspiration, nor a discovery like the inventions of great scholars. It was, instead, a necessity and an answer to desperation. When death came, when ordinary physicians fled or shut their doors, someone needed to step forward. Town councils, desperate to preserve order, began to put their faith in a different kind of medical servant, one who would remain no matter what. These men were not always the most skilled doctors. Many were young physicians, still untested, eager for experience, or hungry for a secure salary. Others were older men, whose practices had not prospered, who found in plague service one final chance for steady work. Some, astonishingly, were not trained physicians at all but were nonetheless contracted to fill the role. The arrangement was almost always the same. A contract was drawn up between the town and the man who would serve. The council promised him food, shelter, and a fixed wage, sometimes a generous one, though often modest by comparison to the danger he faced. In return, he vowed not to flee, not to abandon the sick, not even to put private profit ahead of public service. The written agreements. We know much of this because those contracts survive. On parchment brown with age, the words still echo across centuries. Some declared that the doctor must treat all who came, rich and poor alike. Others promised wages even in the event of death, so that the doctor's family would not starve should he fall to the very sickness he fought. A few of these contracts were astonishingly detailed. They listed the tools that would be provided, cloaks, masks, and gloves in later centuries, or simply lodging, writing supplies, and access to herbs in earlier ones. Some required that the doctor write daily records of cases. Others demanded that he swear to remain within the city walls until the plague had passed. From these agreements, we glimpse not only the duties but also the fear of those who hired him. Town leaders knew that when the pestilence came, even loyalty could vanish. Money, food, and promises of security were all needed to tether one man to his grim duty. Duties of the early plague doctors. What did this man do, day after day, in the heart of an afflicted town? His duties were varied, though none offered much chance of success. He visited the sick in their homes, though often he stood at the threshold, unwilling to venture further than the doorway. He examined swollen buboes, dark spots upon the skin, and fevers that raged without mercy. He prescribed herbs rosemary, sage, lavender, and garlic not because they cured but because they comforted, because they smelled strong enough to mask the odor of death. Sometimes he lanced the swellings, believing that the poison within must be released. He carried vials of vinegar to wash his hands, or he burned pungent resins to drive away bad air. He recorded names in his ledger, a grim catalogue of the fallen. Fathers, mothers, children, entire households. In many places, the plague doctor was also asked to witness wills. As neighbors refused to approach and priests themselves succumbed or fled, it was often the doctor who bent low to hear the last whispered words of the dying. He wrote them down by candlelight, his hand steady even when his heart trembled. Suspicion and fear. Yet for all his service, the plague doctor was often mistrusted. He was paid by the city, not by individuals, and so families sometimes believed he cared little for them. He became, in the minds of many, an omen. To see him at your door was to know that death had arrived. To glimpse him in the distance was to be reminded that no wall, no prayer, no candle could keep the plague entirely away. And yet, behind this reputation was still a man. A man who woke each morning to the same fears as his neighbors, who perhaps longed to run but was bound by oath, by contract, or by necessity to remain. The slow creation of an image. The familiar image we hold today of the long black cloak, the wide-brimmed hat, the staff, and above all the bird-like mask did not belong to the earliest plague doctors. In the 14th century, they looked much like any physician, though perhaps more practical in their clothing, with extra layers of cloth to shield the mouth and nose. It was only in the 17th century that the iconic costume became formalized. By then, medical theories of miasma, or poisonous air, had taken root. To breathe in the stench of plague was believed to invite death. And so, the mask was born, a strange, almost theatrical invention, its long beak stuffed with herbs and sponges soaked in vinegar. The cloak was waxed to repel moisture. The gloves were tied tightly at the wrists. The staff allowed the doctor to prod and examine from a distance. But in chapter 2 of our tale, in these early years, the plague doctor was still forming. He was less a figure of costume than of contract, less a masked phantom than a man pressed into grim service. The myths that would later surround him were only just beginning to stir. Humanity in the midst of horror. It is important, as we rest within this history, to pause and remember the humanity hidden beneath the shadow. Each plague doctor was not simply a role or a mask. He was an individual. Imagine a young man of 25, fresh from study, signing a contract in trembling hands. Imagine an older man, gray in his beard, hoping only to leave his family with bread on the table. Imagine even the untrained, pressed into service, who wrapped cloth around their faces and stepped into the unknown. They were not saints, nor were they demons. They were human beings in a time when choices were few and fear was overwhelming. The birth of a symbol. And so the birth of the plague doctor was not a single moment but a gradual unfolding. Born of contracts and need, of fear and duty, of superstition and a spark of compassion, this figure stepped into history. In time, his image would harden into legend. He would become the beaked phantom of woodcuts and paintings, a silhouette striding through the smoke of pestilence. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth of all. The plague doctor was not only a figure of medicine or of fear. He was a witness. A witness to suffering, a witness to courage, and a witness to the fragile persistence of life in the face of endless death. The outfit of shadows. When we imagine the plague doctor today, we do not see a man with ink-stained fingers writing down the names of the dead. We do not picture him as a weary clerk of mortality, or as a hesitant healer standing in a darkened doorway. Instead, we see the figure that has haunted centuries of memory, the masked silhouette, cloaked in black, faceless and inhuman. This image, with its bird-like mask and wide-brimmed hat, is one of the most striking costumes ever devised in the history of medicine. Yet the story of its creation, its use, and its meaning is far more complicated than the pictures might suggest. The outfit was not simply clothing. It was a barrier, a shield, a ritual, and eventually, a myth. A world of poisonous air. To understand why such an outfit was imagined, we must return to the medical beliefs of the 17th century. By then, plague had haunted Europe for generations. It returned with alarming regularity, and though some thought it divine punishment, many physicians sought explanations in the natural world. The dominant belief was that of miasma, the theory that disease spread through poisoned or corrupted air. The foul stench of rotting bodies, the smoke of crowded cities, the heavy dampness of stagnant canals, all were thought to carry invisible toxins. To breathe this air was to invite sickness into the body. Thus, to survive the plague, one needed protection from breath itself. And so was born the most infamous part of the plague doctor's costume, the mask. The beaked mask. At first glance, it appears almost comical, like something from a carnival or a masquerade. The long curved beak protruding from the face, the round glass eyes staring without expression. But this mask was no ornament. It was designed as a filter, a primitive attempt at respiratory protection. The beak was stuffed with herbs and substances thought to purify the air: dried roses, mint, juniper, cloves, and camphor. Some doctors used vinegar-soaked sponges, believing that sharp, acrid smells could drive away corruption. Others experimented with tobacco or frankincense, filling the beak with smoke and resin. The design allowed the doctor to breathe only through this scented barrier. The air he inhaled was filtered through layers of medicinal plants. In theory, this would neutralize the poisonous vapors of plague. In practice, it provided little real protection. But it gave the doctor, and those who saw him, the impression that he was armored against invisible dangers. From afar, the mask transformed the doctor into something more than human. The bird-like face, with its curved beak, seemed unnatural, almost monstrous. Children cried at the sight. Adults crossed themselves. In a world filled with terror, the mask became another symbol of it. The cloak of darkness. Beneath the mask was the cloak. Usually black, sometimes brown, always heavy. It was made of waxed fabric or leather, designed to repel moisture. To medieval minds, disease could cling to dampness, seep into clothing, and ride upon the fibers of cloth. To wear ordinary wool or linen was to risk carrying the sickness home. The plague doctor's cloak was therefore coated with wax or oil, smooth and resistant. If touched by a patient, it could be wiped clean. If splattered with fluids, for plague was often gruesome in its symptoms, it would not soak through to the skin. The sight of this cloak only added to the fear he inspired. It hung like the robes of a shadow, concealing his form, making him seem larger, broader, less like a neighbor and more like a specter. When he walked the streets, the cloak rustled like wings. In some accounts, he was compared to a crow, a raven, or a carrion bird coming to feast upon the dead. The hat of authority. Upon his head, the plague doctor wore a wide-brimmed hat. At first, this was simply a sign of his profession, for physicians commonly wore hats to mark their status. But in the time of plague, the wide brim took on a new purpose. It shielded the face, cast a shadow over the mask, and, some believed, helped to deflect the falling of droplets or pestilential dust from above. The hat, stiff and tall, completed the silhouette. Without it, the doctor was merely a cloaked man in a strange mask. With it, he became unmistakable, the beaked specter, the crow of death, striding from door to door. The gloves of distance. The hands were another point of danger. Touch was thought to transmit sickness, and indeed, in the case of plague, close contact could bring infection. To guard against this, the doctor wore gloves of leather. Like the cloak, they were sometimes treated with wax or oils. With gloved hands, he could touch patients, examine swellings, or even perform lancing with a small blade. Yet the gloves also added to the sense of detachment. The doctor did not touch flesh to flesh. He remained apart, distant, unreachable. Even his gestures became strange, muffled by the stiffness of leather. The staff of separation. Perhaps the most curious element of the costume was the staff. Long, straight, often made of wood, this rod served. The staff was also symbolic. It was the sign of his authority, his badge of office. To see a man in a cloak and mask without the staff might raise doubt. But with it, there was no mistaking his identity. He was the plague doctor, servant of the city, and witness of suffering. And so the staff, like the mask, became part of the legend. In some images, he is shown raising it like a wand, as though commanding the very air. In others, it trails beside him, tapping against the stones like the footsteps of doom. A complete armor. Together, these elements formed what some called an outfit of shadows. cloak, mask, hat, gloves, staff, each part was meant to guard against contagion. Each was also meant to reassure, to show that the city had not abandoned its people, that someone still dared to walk among the dying. But reassurance is a fragile thing. For many, the sight of the plague doctor was more terrifying than comforting. His face was hidden, his voice muffled by the mask, his eyes reflecting only the glass lenses. He seemed less like a healer and more like a phantom summoned by pestilence. Symbolism and fear. Over time, the costume became a symbol in itself. To see it was to know the plague had arrived. The bird-like mask, in particular, stirred the imagination. Birds were often associated with death, ravens on the battlefield, crows in the gallows field. Some believed the mask resembled a scavenger coming to pick at corpses. Others whispered of demons with bird faces, of omens and portents. Even today, in festivals and carnivals, the plague doctor's mask appears. It is no longer worn with fear but with fascination, as a relic of history's darker chapters. Yet beneath the playful modern mask lingers the echo of its original power, the image of a man armored against death, yet looking more like death itself than life. The weight of the costume. One must also imagine the doctor himself, within this outfit. The mask grew heavy with its stuffing of herbs. The cloak, stiff with wax, grew hot beneath the summer sun. The gloves clung tight, the hat pressed down, the staff weighed upon his arm. To wear such garb for hours was exhausting. To walk the narrow alleys, to bend over the sick, to climb the stairs of crowded houses, all beneath this suffocating armor must have been unbearable. And yet he wore it, day after day, because to remove it was to stand unprotected. The outfit gave him no true shield against plague, but it gave him the courage to enter houses others avoided. It gave him a ritual of safety, a fragile illusion, and sometimes an excuse to keep moving forward. Between truth and myth. The truth of the outfit is simple: it was an invention of its time, born from the miasma theory, crafted to guard against poisoned air. But the myth of the outfit, the way it was seen, remembered, and retold, was something greater. It became the uniform of death itself. A figure cloaked in black, faceless and silent, moving through the streets as bells tolled and carts rumbled with the dead. In woodcuts and drawings, in whispered tales, the image spread. Long after the plague had passed, the figure remained in memory, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strange forms that fear can take. And so the plague doctor's outfit was not merely clothing. It was a symbol, a shadow stitched into fabric, a mask that turned man into myth. To see it was to feel a shiver, to know that death was near. And to remember it is to step back into a world where even healing wore the face of terror. The daily life of a plague doctor. The bells rang differently in a city of plague. They did not mark the cheerful hours of trade, nor the laughter of markets, nor the rush of workers setting out at dawn. Instead, they told in solemn rhythm, each striking a reminder of the night's losses, each echoing a shadow cast across the waking day. For the plague doctor, the day began not with birdsong, nor with sunlight through shutters, but with ritual. To step outside was to step into contagion, and so each morning, before even leaving his chamber, he dressed for battle. Dressing the armor. He began with a simple linen shirt, worn close to the skin. Over this came layers, each chosen not for comfort but for protection. His heavy cloak, stiff with wax, hung upon his shoulders like lead. The gloves followed, drawn tight around his wrists, the leather creaking faintly as he flexed his fingers. The hat was set upon his head, broad-brimmed and stiff. And then came the mask. He lifted it carefully, as though holding the skull of a bird, and tied its straps behind his head. Within the beak, the herbs had already been prepared: rosemary and cloves, a sponge soaked with vinegar, a sprig of juniper. Their sharp aroma filled the air, stinging the nostrils, pressing down upon the senses. Once dressed, he was no longer himself. He was transformed. His own features had vanished, replaced by the staring lenses and the curved beak. He breathed through filters of leaves and smoke, his voice muffled and strange. To look in the small mirror by the wall was to see a shadow, faceless and anonymous. And yet this transformation was necessary. Without it, he was merely a man, vulnerable to the poisoned air that lurked in the streets. With it, he became the plague doctor, a figure apart, both feared and needed. The walk into the city. Leaving his lodgings, he stepped into streets that no longer bustled. Where once merchants had called and children had played, there was now silence broken only by the roll of the death cart. Curtains were drawn across windows. Doors were marked with painted crosses. His staff tapped softly upon the stones as he walked. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing in a hollow chest. Some watched him from afar, peering through cracks in shutters. A few crossed themselves as he passed. Others turned away, unwilling to look upon the beaked mask, unwilling to be reminded of what it signified. The city seemed both emptier and more crowded than ever, emptier of life, yet crowded with fear. Every alleyway whispered of sickness. Every breath seemed heavy with unseen dangers. First visits. The doctor's morning often began with visits to the sick. Families summoned him not always in hope of a cure, but in hope of guidance, or at least acknowledgement. To have the plague doctor enter one's home was to admit the sickness aloud, to see it marked and recorded. He would knock softly, then enter, the scent of vinegar and herbs preceding him. Inside, rooms were dim, lit only by candles or by the faint glow of daylight through shuttered windows. The patient might lie upon a straw mattress, covered with blankets. The swellings of plague, the buboes rose upon the body like dark knots. Some groaned in fever. Others stared silently, already slipping away. The doctor moved slowly, his staff helping him lift a sheet, his gloved hand touching a wrist to feel for pulse. He listened to breath, observed the color of the skin, asked questions through the muffling of his mask. Often, there was little he could do. He might lance a swelling, believing it would release corruption. He might apply poultices of herbs, or recommend fumigation with burning resins. He might prescribe bleeding, or suggest diets of bread and water, wine and vinegar, or garlic. None of these truly cured the plague, but they were offered in sincerity, with the hope that at least some might find relief. To the families, his presence carried weight. To see him bend over the sick, to hear his muffled voice pronounce a judgment, was to feel that the sickness had been recognized by authority. Yet it was also a shadow of finality, for few left the plague doctor's care with real hope of recovery. Recording the dead. When a patient passed, as so many did, the doctor's role shifted from healer to scribe. He carried with him a ledger, and in it he wrote names, ages, and causes. The ink of his pen became the tally of mortality, a grim account that city officials demanded. He was not only a physician, he was a witness of history's darkest count. Each day, his book grew heavier, though its weight was not of paper alone. Wherever he went, people drew back. Even the healthy avoided his approach, fearing that to stand too near was to invite plague upon themselves. The mask that was meant to protect him also repelled others. He moved through the city like a ghost, untouchable, isolated, accompanied only by the soft tapping of his staff. Midday rest. By midday, he returned briefly to his lodging. He ate little, for appetite was dulled by the constant presence of sickness. Bread, cheese, perhaps wine. He washed his hands in vinegar, changed the herbs in his mask, and sat in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the city. The bells tolled again, announcing burials. The cartwheels rumbled past. Somewhere, a voice wept behind shuttered doors. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe more deeply, to rest. And then, with the cloak and mask renewed, he stepped out again. Afternoon rounds. The afternoon was often the hardest. By then, the heat of the sun pressed down, making the waxed cloak stifling, the mask unbearable. The herbs within grew dry, their fragrance sharp and bitter. Sweat collected beneath the leather gloves, and each step felt heavier than the last. Yet still, he went from house to house, street to street. He was called to examine the sick, to judge whether the symptoms were plague or some lesser fever. He was asked to certify deaths, to record households struck down, to estimate when and how the sickness might spread. Sometimes, he spoke to children who survived while parents lay dying. Sometimes, he stood by a bed where a mother whispered farewells. Sometimes, he left behind a family already half consumed by loss. His words were often few. He was not a priest offering prayers, though sometimes he murmured them quietly. He was not a magician offering charms, though some begged him for such. He was a doctor bound to observe, to prescribe what knowledge allowed, and to leave. Evening shadows. As the sun lowered, shadows lengthened across the narrow streets. Smoke rose from pyres where clothing and bedding were burned. The air grew heavier with the scent of ash and resin, mingled with the ever-present odor of decay. The doctor made his final rounds, checking upon patients visited in the morning, speaking with attendants, updating his ledger. His staff tapped more slowly now, for his strength was waning. By the time the bells rang again tolling for evening burials, he turned back toward his lodging. The streets were nearly empty. The shutters were closed. The city seemed to hold its breath. Returning home. At his door, he paused. The ritual of undressing was as careful as that of dressing. The gloves were removed first, dropped into vinegar. The cloak was wiped with cloth soaked in strong-smelling liquids. The mask was untied, its herbs discarded, its beak scrubbed. At last, bare-faced, he looked once more into the small mirror. A man stared back, weary, pale, lines etched by fatigue. For a moment, he scarcely recognized himself, as though the mask had imprinted upon him its own inhuman face. He ate in silence. He wrote again in his ledger, copying notes, preparing reports for city officials. And then, as darkness filled the streets, he lay down upon his bed. Sleep came slowly. The sounds of the city never ceased, the bells, the carts, the cries. Yet exhaustion claimed him at last, and with it came dreams, sometimes of healing, sometimes of shadows, sometimes of walking endlessly through streets where every door was marked, every face hidden, every breath uncertain. A life between two worlds. Thus passed a day in the life of a plague doctor. It was a life suspended between roles, part healer, part recorder, part guardian, part omen. From the first strike of the morning bell to the last toll of the evening, his presence was both comfort and terror. He moved through houses, streets, and graves like a shadow wrapped in human form. He was needed but feared, welcomed but avoided, respected but pitied. And always, he walked in silence, his staff marking the rhythm of his lonely duty, his mask filling his lungs with the scent of herbs, his cloak whispering as it brushed against the stones of a city gripped by death. The patients and their families. When the plague doctor knocked upon a door, the sound was not like any ordinary visitor. It was a sound heavy with meaning, for his arrival announced what most households dreaded to admit, that death had entered the home. Behind every door marked with a painted cross lay stories of suffering, of endurance, of love tested against fear. Families watched him come and go, their faces pale in the glow of a candle, their voices hushed with both gratitude and dread. The doctor's day may have been filled with routine dressing, walking, recording, prescribing, but for the people he visited, each moment of his presence burned into memory like a brand upon the heart. The sick bed. For the patients themselves, the sight of the beaked figure was often the first confirmation that their illness was more than fever, more than weariness. They might have suspected it already, feeling the swellings rise beneath the skin, feeling the shivers that no fire could warm. But when the doctor entered, with his gloved hands and glassy eyes, their suspicions hardened into truth. Imagine the room, narrow, dim, with shutters closed against the outside air. A single candle flickers, its wax dripping in uneven trails. The patient lies upon a straw mattress, sometimes in their own sweat, sometimes covered in rough blanket. For some, the doctor's presence brought a kind of relief. To be acknowledged was to be seen, to have one's suffering measured was to feel less alone. Even if cures were uncertain, even if his remedies seemed strange poultices of herbs, lancing of buboes, fumigation with smoke, there was still the comfort of action, the sense that something was being done. But for others, the sight of him was terror itself. The mask looked less like a healer and more like an omen. His words were difficult to hear, and his touch felt distant through the barrier of leather. He was not a neighbor, not a friend, but a shadow with a ledger, and many believed his presence marked not life, but the nearness of death. The mothers and fathers. When children fell ill, it was often the parents who pleaded most desperately. A mother would kneel beside the bed, clutching her child's hand, begging the doctor to save them. She would ask for potions, prayers, anything that might keep the fever from burning too bright. A father might pace the room, offering money, promising favors, asking whether bleeding, or bathing, or purging might restore strength. The doctor would answer as best he could, prescribing according to the wisdom of his training. He might instruct them to burn herbs in the chamber, to wash linens in vinegar, to feed the child broth of garlic and sage. He might lance the swellings, catching the foulness in a dish. He might reassure in muffled tones that some had recovered, that hope was not lost. Yet his words could only go so far. Parents saw the truth in their children's eyes, saw how the little hands grew cold, how the breaths came thin and shallow. For many, the doctor's visit became less about hope and more about acknowledgement, a final attempt, a ritual of trying, before surrender to grief. And when death came, as it so often did, the cries of parents filled the house with a sorrow that lingered long after the doctor had gone. The children. There were also children who watched the doctor arrive not as patients but as witnesses. From corners of rooms, from stairways and doorways, they peered with wide eyes at the strange figure with the bird's face. Some thought him a monster, creeping into their home with staff and mask. They clung to their mothers, trembling at the sight of him. Others thought him almost magical, a creature from stories who came at the call of suffering. For those children who survived, the memory of the plague doctor never faded. They would remember the sharp smell of herbs, the scrape of leather gloves, the glint of glass lenses in the dim light. They would remember the hush that fell when he entered, the way adults spoke softly, the way fear seemed to thicken the very air. In time, they would grow, but the shadow of the doctor would remain in their minds, a symbol of the days when death walked their streets. The neighbors. It was not only families who felt his presence. Neighbors, too, were touched by his. When the plague doctor stopped at a door, whispers spread quickly along the street. Faces appeared at windows, curtains twitched. Some muttered prayers. Others crossed themselves. A few shook their heads, knowing that the sickness would soon spread from one house to the next. The marked doors became symbols of warning. Those who lived nearby avoided them, keeping distance, walking on the far side of the street. Children were told not to play outside. Shops closed their shutters early. And so, the doctor's visits rippled outward, casting fear not only within households but across whole neighborhoods. His beaked mask was not just for those he tended, it was for everyone who saw him pass, a silent reminder that the plague was near. The unspoken bargain. There was always an unspoken bargain between the doctor and the families. They knew he could not cure as one might cure a broken bone or a simple fever. They knew that many who entered his care did not live to see another sunrise. Yet still they called him. Still they opened their doors. Still they pleaded for remedies, for guidance, for records to be written. In return, he gave what he could: knowledge, observation, ritual, presence. His work was as much symbolic as it was practical. He stood as a bridge between the suffering family and the greater world beyond, between the intimacy of grief and the machinery of the city. Even when his treatments failed, his role mattered. For the sick, he offered the dignity of being seen. For the families, he offered the comfort of having tried. For the community, he offered the assurance that the plague was being managed, however imperfectly. The farewells. One of the most human moments came not in the treatments themselves, but in the farewells. When the doctor left a house, the family often followed him to the door. They asked one last question, one last plea. Should the patient be bled again? Should the herbs be changed? Was there hope? His answers were muffled, sometimes cautious, sometimes kind. But once he stepped into the street, the door closed behind him, and the family was left to face the night alone. Inside, they would sit beside their sick, holding hands, whispering prayers, watching the candle burn low. They would remember the mask, the staff, the strange voice, and they would wait for recovery, or for the bell to toll once more. The memory of the visit. For survivors, the memory of a plague doctor's visit lingered long after the sickness had passed. It became a story told again and again, how the beaked man entered the house, how he smelled of vinegar. In the years that followed, when the plague had passed and life returned, those who had seen him often described him as if describing a dream. Some said he was like a ghost. Others, like a crow who had taken human form. A few even remembered him with gratitude, though his cures had been powerless, because he had come when others would not. The shared humanity. Beneath all the fear and mystery, there was something profoundly human in those encounters. The doctor, hidden behind a mask and cloak, and the families, shivering in candlelight, they shared the same fragility, the same dread, the same yearning for life. For the sick, every glance toward him was a plea for another day, another breath. For the families, every question was an attempt to hold back the tide of loss. And for the doctor himself, every visit was another step into grief not his own, yet felt in the silence of his heart. In these houses, surrounded by shadows and whispers, the plague was not an abstraction. It was a face pale with fever, a hand trembling with weakness, a child's cry, a mother's prayer. It was the sound of coughing in the night, the smell of herbs and smoke, the toll of bells outside the window. And through it all, the plague doctor moved like a figure in a dream, feared, needed, remembered. Nights of the plague doctor. The day's footsteps faded with the last toll of the evening bell. The streets, once crowded with merchants, beggars, and the rumble of carts, fell silent beneath the cloak of night. Doors were bolted, shutters drawn tight, and candles snuffed to save the wax. Only a few faint lanterns flickered in the distance, swinging on iron hooks, their light barely piercing the dark. It was in these hours, when the city seemed more shadow than stone, that the plague doctor found himself most alone. The mask that had been his shield through the day still covered his face, the leather heavy and hot, but now there were no families to reassure, no patients to observe, no records to scratch upon parchment. Only silence, broken by the rustle of rats and the faraway barking of dogs. The walk home. His staff tapped against the cobblestones as he made his way through the narrow lanes. Each step echoed, long and hollow, as if the streets themselves had become empty corridors in some vast forgotten palace. Sometimes he passed the red-marked doors, painted with a warning cross. From within, faint moans rose into the night, or the sound of weeping, muffled by stone walls. He paused but did not enter. His rounds for the day were over, and the city was not asleep. It was restless, like a fevered body tossing in its bed. Somewhere a cart rattled by, carrying the dead to the burial ground. Somewhere a bell clanged, signaling another passing soul. The doctor walked on, his shadow long beneath the lanterns. The return to quarters. At last, he reached his quarters, a modest chamber set apart from the busiest streets, chosen for its seclusion. The door creaked as he entered, closing off the world outside. The first act of every night was to strip away the layers of his protection. He removed the staff and leaned it against the wall. He unfastened the long cloak, shaking from it the dust of the streets. The gloves came off, sticky with sweat, and were set aside for cleaning. Then, at last, he lifted the mask from his face. The air felt strange without it, cooler, sharper, carrying with it the sense of the room rather than the herbal mixtures he had grown used to breathing. He rubbed at the ridges where the mask had pressed into his skin, leaving faint marks upon his cheeks. On the table lay a basin filled with water mixed with vinegar. Into it he dipped his hands, scrubbing carefully, for he knew that invisible dangers clung to skin as much as to cloth. He washed until the water grew cloudy, then dried himself with a linen cloth that would later be burned. Only then did he allow himself to sit, shoulders sinking with exhaustion. The silence within. Night brought not only physical stillness but also the rising of thoughts kept at bay during the day. While tending the sick, while walking the streets, while writing his records, his mind had been occupied with tasks. But in solitude, memory stirred. He thought of the faces he had seen. The child who tried to smile though fever burned. The woman who clutched his gloved hand as though it were the last rope binding her to life. The man who had begged for more time, whispering prayers as the doctor leaned over him. He had learned to keep his own emotions hidden, for to show sorrow or fear would weaken his presence in the eyes of families. Yet at night, alone, the mask removed, there was no shield against his own heart. Was he truly helping? Or was he merely bearing witness to a tide of suffering that could not be turned? These questions pressed upon him like weights, and though he tried to push them aside, they returned, night after night, like the tolling of a bell in the distance. Writing by candlelight. On the table stood a thick ledger, its pages already filled with rows of ink. Each night, before extinguishing the candle, he recorded what he had seen. Names, ages, the nature of the swellings, the days of fever, the remedies attempted. He noted whether the patient lived through the night or did not. These records were meant for the authorities, to track the spread of the pestilence. But to him, they also became a ritual, a way of ordering the chaos. Every line was a life, compressed into a few words of script. Every number in the margin was a person he had touched, a household he had entered, a moment of fear he had witnessed. Sometimes his hand trembled as he wrote, the candlelight flickering across his page. He paused, staring at the ink blotting into the parchment, before forcing himself to continue. To stop writing would be to surrender to despair. To write was to hold fast to structure, to say, this happened, it mattered, it will be remembered. The private fears. When the writing was done, when the candle burned low, fear often crept in. He wondered whether the cough he felt was from the smoke of herbs or something deeper. Whether the weariness in his bones was from the long day or from the sickness itself, already lurking inside. He examined his hands by lamplight, searching for signs of swelling, a rash, a darkening of the skin. He checked the mirror, tilting his face this way and that. Nothing. Yet he knew that many before him had felt the same healthy one day, fevered the next. The mask, the cloak, the gloves, the vinegar, they were all defenses, but none were perfect. He lived each night with the quiet knowledge that he might not wake the next morning. That perhaps tomorrow's rounds would be made by another, and he would become only another entry in the ledger. The city at night. From his window, he could see the restless city. The streets glimmered faintly, washed in moonlight. Figures sometimes moved in the distance, gravediggers with their carts, priests carrying lanterns, watchmen making rounds. The cries of the afflicted drifted faintly, carried by the wind. At times he saw shadows flit along the rooftops, cats chasing rats, or perhaps simply illusions of his weary eyes. The city seemed alive, breathing, shuddering, dreaming uneasy dreams. The bells rang again. Another death. He closed his eyes and bowed his head. Dreams. When at last he lay down to rest, sleep came fitfully. Dreams carried him back through the day, replaying the faces of the sick. Sometimes he dreamed of walking through streets where every door was marked, every window shuttered, and he was the only living soul. Other times he dreamed of removing his mask only to find another mask beneath, and another, never reaching his true face. He would wake with a start, heart racing, and listen to the silence. The city never fully slept, even in the deepest hours. The plague was, the night's solitude, the fears, the dreams, all were folded away, hidden beneath the outward image of calm. Families would look at him and see not a weary man but the figure of the doctor, the one who walked between life and death. And so the cycle continued, day of visits, night of solitude, day of visits again. A rhythm as relentless as the tolling of the bells. The unseen burden. In these nights of silence, what endured most was not the mask or the treatments, but the weight of memory. Every patient he could not save, every family he left grieving, every street he passed that echoed with loss, all of it followed him into the darkness. Yet he endured. For if he did not, who would? The nights belonged to his solitude, but the dawn belonged to his duty. And between them lay the fragile thread of his own humanity, stretched thin, but not yet broken. The tools of hope and desperation. By day, the plague doctor walked the streets with his mask, cloak, and staff. Yet when he returned to his chamber, when the door closed behind him, there lay a quieter world, the realm of his tools. Upon the wooden table rested small boxes, jars, vials, and bundles of herbs. To another's eyes, it may have seemed a cabinet of curiosities, a mingling of apothecary and alchemist, physician and priest. But to him, it was the armory with which he faced the unseen enemy. They were humble objects, sometimes crude, sometimes strange, sometimes born of superstition as much as science. And yet, in their variety, they told the story of a time when medicine and mystery were woven together. These were the tools of hope, and of desperation. The staff, a wand of authority. The first tool, carried openly for all to see, was the staff. Long and polished, often of sturdy wood, it served not only as support but also as a barrier. With it, he could point to the afflicted without touching them, or push aside clothes, or measure distance. Families understood its gesture. When he lifted the staff, they stepped back. But it was more than practical. In the dim minds of those who watched him pass, the staff resembled the rod of Moses, the scepter of a judge, the wand of a conjurer. Its tap upon the cobblestones carried the sound of authority. Each strike upon the ground declared, "Here walks the doctor, keeper of boundaries between sickness and safety." The mask, an altar of breath. Upon the mask rested not only his face but his very life. The long beak, stuffed with herbs and sponges, filtered the air. Rosemary, mint, cloves, camphor, myrrh, each to him, the mask was both prison and salvation. Behind it, his voice emerged muffled, ghost-like. Through it, he breathed not the city's foul air but a perfumed mixture, sharp and heady. The mask was a portable altar, a reminder that every breath was a prayer, every inhalation a wager against the unseen. Gloves and cloak, skin of protection. The gloves and cloak, fashioned of waxed leather or oiled fabric, were armor against touch. He had learned quickly that sickness clung not only to the air but to skin, to cloth, to the smallest brush of contact. When he stretched a gloved hand toward a patient, he extended not himself but a layer of distance. The cloak, long and sweeping, wrapped him in a shell. It rustled when he moved, heavy yet comforting, like the wings of some great bird of night. Together, cloak and gloves were his second skin, not soft like flesh, but firm like the idea of survival. The cane for testing. Beside the staff lay a smaller tool. A slender cane, sometimes tipped with metal. With this, he prodded swellings, testing the nature of a bubble without breaking the skin. It was a cruel necessity, for touch could spread death. The cane was an extension of his sight, a way to feel without truly feeling. And yet, when families watched, they saw in this simple motion not only examination but judgment. The cane descended, tapped lightly, and the doctor would nod. To those who loved the patient, that nod was as heavy as a verdict. The lancet, a blade of blood. In his leather case rested the lancet, small and sharp, its metal catching the candlelight. With it, he lanced the swellings, releasing the foul humors believed to poison the body. The practice was ancient to let the sickness flow outward, to drain the corruption. He knew the cries it caused, the pain of the cut, the fear in the eyes of the patient. Yet he also knew that sometimes, after the blood and pus flowed, relief came. A lessening of pressure, a cooling of fever, even if only for a while. The lancet was both cruel and merciful, a paradox in steel. It was a blade of hope, and of last resort. The mortar and pestle, stone of transformation. Upon the table sat a mortar and pestle, stained with herbs ground into powder. With a steady hand he crushed roots and leaves, seeds and spices, turning them into poultices, powders, and draughts. The sound of grinding was soft yet rhythmic, a music of its own. Each mixture was a gamble. Sage for cleansing. Rue for protection. Garlic for strength. Opium for pain. Quicksilver, fumigations, the breath of fire. Smoke was another shield. He carried bundles of herbs to burn in homes, filling the rooms with thick clouds meant to drive out corruption. Juniper, laurel, sulfur, and pitch each chosen for its pungency. Families coughed as the smoke curled around them, yet they endured, believing it better to choke on herbs than on the plague. To the doctor, the smoke carried double meaning. It was medicine, yes, but also ritual. Fire consumed what flesh could not. Smoke ascended like incense, as though rising prayers for mercy. In each fumigation, he saw both science and supplication. Potions and concoctions, elixirs of uncertainty. The shelves held vials of liquid, each with a faint label scratched in Latin or the local tongue. Vinegar infused with roses. Wine steeped with wormwood. Waters distilled from fennel, hyssop, or angelica. These potions were offered in small sips, often bitter to taste. Some families placed great trust in them, kissing the vial before handing it to their kin. Others doubted but drank anyway, for what was there to lose? The doctor himself often wondered, were these draughts healing, or only illusions? Yet he gave them, for sometimes the very act of drinking, the belief in medicine, stirred strength in the heart. And sometimes belief itself was the strongest cure available. Charms and amulets, faith worn on the body. Not all tools were born of science. Some came from faith, from fear, from ancient custom. Around the doctor's neck sometimes hung a small cross. In his pouch he kept medals of saints, tiny written prayers folded into packets or strings of beads. Families often pressed charms into his hands, begging him to leave them with the sick. Small figures carved of bone, rings inscribed with sacred words. The staff was distant. The mask was survival. The cloak was armor. The cane was judgment. The lancet was sacrificed. The mortar was transformed. The smoke was purified. The potions were believable. The charms were prayer. The book was a memory. Together, they formed not only the doctor's arsenal but also his language, a way to speak to the world when words were too small for the weight of suffering. Hope and desperation entwined. As he looked upon his tools each night, he saw both sides of them. Hope, because they offered something, a barrier, a remedy, a chance. Desperation, because often they failed, and yet still he used them, for to do nothing was unthinkable. They were bridges between knowledge and faith, between what could be explained and what could only be endured. In their strange mixture lay the truth of his time, that medicine was not yet certainty, but still an act of courage. And so, each morning, he gathered them again. The staff, the mask, the cloak. The herbs, the smoke, the book. He stepped into the streets armed not with certainty, but with the fragile strength of hope bound tightly to desperation. For what else was there? The plague doctor and the church. By day, he was seen as a man of medicine, carrying his staff, cloaked in black, moving like a shadow through the plague-stricken streets. But in the eyes of many, he was more than a physician. He was part of a world where medicine was not separate from faith, but entangled with it, a world where the church shaped the way sickness was understood, and the way healing was sought. The plague doctor walked at the edge of two great powers, the knowledge of the body, and the mysteries of the soul. The shadow of faith over medicine. In those centuries, few separated the body from the spirit. Illness was not only a wound of flesh but a mark upon the soul, a punishment, a trial, or a test. The plague itself was often described in sermons as the wrath of God, descending upon a sinful people. To the church, the physician's art was tolerated, but never sovereign. Healing came first from the divine through prayer, repentance, and the sacraments. The doctor's tools were seen as useful, but incomplete, for without grace, what power had herbs and blades against the hand of heaven? Thus, when the plague doctor arrived at a bedside, families often asked him not only for medicine but for signs of blessing. They crossed themselves at his entry, whispered prayers as he worked, and looked not only to his mask and staff but to the crucifix above the bed. The bells of penance. Morning often began with the sound of bells. Not the cheerful tolls of feast days, but the slow, mournful peals that marked death, penance, or procession. The bells were the voice of the church, carried through every street, reminding the living of the fragility of their days. As he walked beneath their sound, the plague doctor felt them as much as heard them. Each toll was a reminder that he was not only fighting sickness but moving within a world defined by ritual. Every step he took was framed by the prayers of friars, the chants of monks, the hymns of women kneeling in chapels. Processions of prayer. When the plague deepened, the church often called the people to processions. Priests lifted relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, sacred icons, and carried them through the streets. The faithful followed barefoot, chanting psalms, holding candles, begging for mercy. The plague doctor sometimes stood at the edges of these processions, his mask a stark silhouette among the faithful. Families looked at him uneasily, as if he too were a ritual figure neither wholly of the church, nor apart from it. His mask resembled the beak of a bird of omen, yet his presence was tolerated, even respected. For he, too, walked in the great drama of salvation and suffering. Priests and physicians, a shared burden. At the bedsides of the dying, the plague doctor often found not only families but priests. The priest came with holy oil, with words of confession, with prayers of absolution. The doctor came with herbs, smoke, and touch of his staff. Sometimes they worked side by side, neither interfering with the other. The priest bent low to hear whispered sins, the doctor bent low to inspect the swollen skin. One prepared the soul, the other tended the flesh. Yet there were tensions. Some priests warned against over-reliance on physicians, saying only repentance could cure the pestilence. Some doctors resented the church's suspicion, for it was easier to claim sickness as punishment than to search for earthly causes. But both carried the same burden, to stand before the dying, to face grief without flinching. Rituals of death. When the doctor closed the eyes of a patient, his duty ended, but the church's began. Bells tolled again. The priest returned, sprinkling holy water, chanting prayers for the departed. Processions formed, carrying the body to consecrated ground. For the people, these rituals were as necessary as any medicine. Without them, death felt incomplete, terrifying. A plague death was not only feared for its pain, but for the danger of being buried without rites, without prayer, without hope of resurrection. Thus, the plague doctor's presence was always woven with the churches. He could ease the living, but the priest must guard the dead. The doctor as a liminal figure. In many eyes, the plague doctor himself seemed almost like a priest of another order. His mask resembled a relic, his cloak a vestment, his staff a scepter. He entered homes like a ritual figure, shrouded, silent, speaking in muffled tones. Children stared at him as they would at a carved saint or a painted demon. Some feared him, whispering that he was an omen of death. Others respected him, seeing in his very strangeness a sign that he belonged to the great mysteries. He was not simply a man of medicine, he was a man who walked between worlds, between flesh and spirit, between science and sacrament. Faith and healing intertwined. The plague doctor himself often prayed. Alone at night, when he removed his mask, he looked at the crucifix above his bed and whispered words of protection. He prayed for his patients, for their families, for his own safety. For in a time when so little was understood, prayer was as natural a tool as the lancet or the mortar. And he understood that for his patients, belief was often more powerful than any potion. A prayer could steady the heart, calm the breath, give courage in the face of pain. Faith could not cure the plague, but it could strengthen the spirit, and sometimes, that strength made the difference between despair and endurance. Conflict and coexistence. Not all were in harmony. Some priests accused plague doctors of meddling with forbidden arts, of trusting in herbs more than in heaven. Some doctors accused priests of filling the people with fear of sin instead of guiding them to practical remedies. Yet both endured because both were needed. The people wanted medicine, but also miracles. They wanted herbs, but also holy water. They wanted the plague doctor's mask, and the priest's blessing. It was not a matter of choosing one or the other, it was a matter of holding both, for in times of fear, every form of hope was welcome. The doctor in the eyes of the church. Officially, the plague doctor was often sanctioned by civic authorities, not by bishops. Yet the church could not ignore him. He moved among the people, tended to their bodies, and was present at their most desperate hours. Some clergy regarded him as a servant of God's mercy, even if in strange attire. Others viewed him with suspicion, his mask and cloak too close to superstition. Yet the truth was simpler, he was necessary. And necessity often softened judgment. Symbol of both realms. In time, the plague doctor came to symbolize more than an occupation. He became an emblem of a world caught between the old and the new, between faith and knowledge. To the church, he was a figure who reminded them of humanity's limits. To the people, he was a shadow who carried both danger and comfort. To himself, he was merely a man, struggling with tools and prayers alike, hoping that some combination might save at least one more life. The cross and the staff. Perhaps the most telling image was this: in one hand, the priest raised the cross. In the other, the plague doctor raised the staff. Two figures, side by side, standing at the foot of a dying man's bed. One tending to the soul, the other to the flesh. One speaking of eternity, the other of survival. Together they formed a strange harmony, not always in agreement, not always at peace, but together in the same room, bound by the same silence, facing the same suffering. And in that fragile alliance lay the truth of the age, that faith and medicine were not enemies, but companions in a time when both were too weak to stand alone. Closing the chapter. Thus, the plague doctor's story was always entangled with the church. He could not walk the streets without hearing the bells, without seeing the processions, without feeling the prayers that surrounded his every step. He was not a priest, yet he moved among rituals. He was not a monk, yet he wore a robe like one. His mask was not a relic, yet it became as sacred in its way as any crucifix. His staff was not a crozier, yet it commanded silence like one. He was a liminal figure, moving between worlds, a physician of bodies in a city ruled by faith. And so, the people looked upon him not only as a doctor but as a sign. A sign of suffering, yes, but also a sign of endurance, of the mingling of hope and fear, medicine and miracle, flesh and spirit. The children of the plague. In every age of sorrow, it is the voices of children that haunt the longest. Their laughter, once bright in courtyards and alleyways, fell silent when the plague came. Their games ended, their toys lay abandoned, their beds too often became their graves. And yet, even in the darkest hours, children saw the world differently. Where adults saw the plague doctor as an omen, children looked with a mixture of terror and fascination. His tall figure, his cloak, his beaked mask, these were to them like the creatures of fairy tales, half monster, half savior. The first glimpse. Imagine a child peering through a narrow window, too young to understand why neighbors were weeping in the street. Then comes the figure, tall, dark, faceless, with a bird's beak and gloved hands. To the child, he seems neither man nor beast, but something out of a nightmare or storybook. Some children screamed and hid at the sight of him. Others followed him through alleys at a distance, curious, whispering among themselves, was he a man? Was he a bird? Was he death himself, walking on two legs? For children, whose imaginations colored everything, the plague doctor became a shadow woven into their dreams. Whispers in the night. Parents sometimes used his name as a warning, "Go to bed, or the doctor will come." In whispered stories, he was said to steal away naughty children, placing them in his sack and carrying them to the pest houses. And yet, those same children, when fever struck, would look up at him with desperate eyes, hoping he carried some secret cure. To them, he was both a bogeyman and last chance. At night, in cramped sleeping rooms, children whispered to each other about the figure they had seen. Some said he was hollow inside, an empty cloak filled with smoke. Others said he was a saint in disguise, sent by God to chase away the plague. No two stories matched, but all were told in trembling voices beneath thin blankets. Games among the shadows. Even in the midst of fear, children found ways to make games. Some imitated the doctor, fashioning paper beaks, cloaks from scraps of cloth, and sticks for staff. They marched through alleys, pretending to inspect their friends, declaring them sick or cured. It was a play born of terror, yet also of understanding. For children repeat in games what they see in life, turning dread into ritual. These little imitations were echoes of the doctor's solemn work, reshaped into laughter, if only for a moment. The sick beds of children. But play could not shield them. The plague did not spare the young. Infants wasted away in cradles, toddlers burned with fevers they could not describe, older children clutched at their mothers' hands, unable to rise from straw beds. The doctor entered these rooms with a heaviness unlike any other. To see a grown man gasp for breath was one thing, to see a child's body racked with the same agony was another. Often, he could do little more than comfort. He might place a pouch of herbs beside the child, burn incense to clear the air, offer sips of bitter draughts. Parents watched his every movement, their faces etched with desperation. But the plague was merciless, and more often than not, the child's small frame grew still. Parents' desperate bargains. In those moments, the cries of parents shook the walls. Some fell to their knees, begging the doctor to try again, to do something more. Some clutched at his cloak, refusing to let him leave. Others rushed to churches, lighting candles, promising offerings, vowing pilgrimages if only their child might be spared. The plague made beggars of all parents. No price was too high, no ritual too strange, if it meant saving a child. And the doctor, though he tried to harden himself, carried those cries within him. Every child lost weighed upon him more than a dozen grown men. For the sight of wasted youth was not just sorrow, it was the image of futures stolen, of laughter that would never return. Children who survived. Yet not all stories ended in grief. Some children survived, their bodies frail but unbroken, their eyes bright with stubborn will. When such a child opened their eyes after a fever, the household rejoiced as if a miracle had taken place. Neighbors gathered to see the child who had been snatched back from death. Parents clutched them tightly, whispering prayers of thanks. And the plague doctor, though outwardly calm, felt a quiet surge of relief. In such rare victories, he found strength to continue his weary work. These survivors carried memories into adulthood, memories of the beaked figure leaning over them, of the smell of herbs, of muffled words spoken through a mask. Some would tell their own children, decades later, of the strange doctor who had visited their bed when all seemed lost. The doctor's own memories. For the doctor himself, the faces of children lingered longest. He remembered the way small hands reached toward him, the way wide eyes searched his mask for some hint of humanity. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he thought he heard their voices again, calling faintly for water, for comfort, for their mothers. These memories weighed heavily, yet they also gave his work meaning. For each child saved was a spark against the darkness, a reminder that his labor was not in vain. The silent streets. As the plague deepened, the silence of the streets told its own story. Where once children's laughter had filled the air, now only the shuffle of feet and the toll of bells could be heard. Empty swings, broken toys, and abandoned games lay scattered in courtyards, mute memorials to the young lives taken. The city itself seemed to mourn its children. Every silent alley, every shuttered schoolroom, every echo of laughter remembered but not heard all bore witness to the toll of the plague. A figure of terror, a figure of hope. To children, the plague doctor remained a paradox. Some died in terror of him, believing he was death coming to carry them away. Others lived because of him, remembering him as a shadowed guardian who stood beside their bed when no one else dared. Perhaps that is why his image has endured. For in the eyes of children, he was not just a doctor. He was the embodiment of the age itself, fearful, mysterious, and yet, in some way, a bearer of hope. Closing the chapter. And so, the story of the plague cannot be told without the children. Their voices, though often silenced, are woven into every cry, every prayer, every tolling bell. The plague doctor carried their memory as he walked the streets, knowing that in each home he entered, it was often the youngest who suffered most. In their fear, their games, their whispered stories, and their too frequent deaths, the children of the plague revealed the deepest wound of all, that even innocence was not spared. The beaked figure they feared and admired became, for them, both the last face they saw and the strange protector who lingered in their dreams. The city in quarantine. There is a silence that is not peace. A silence that comes not from rest but from fear, not from harmony but from absence. This was the silence that settled over cities in the plague years. Streets once filled with clamor, laughter, the hawking of merchants, the ring of church bells in celebration all fell into a hush broken only by the tolling of the dead. When the order of quarantine was declared, the transformation was swift and merciless. Cities that had once been open arteries of trade and travel became locked boxes, their gates sealed, their walls bristling with guards who let no one in and no one out. The lifeblood of exchange, bread from the countryside, fabrics from distant markets, ships bearing wine and oil, was halted. And in that halting, life itself seemed to stop. Gates closed, roads deserted. At the city gates, where once merchants displayed silks and spices, soldiers now stood with spears crossed. Travelers were turned away or confined in rough huts outside the walls, forced to wait the long weeks of isolation before entry was permitted if it was permitted at all. On the roads leading outward, weeds began to grow between paving stones. Carts sat abandoned. Footsteps became rare. Entire villages that relied on the city's trade withered in tandem, as if they too were caught in the iron grip of quarantine. And inside the walls, the people felt themselves imprisoned. The world beyond might as well have been another continent. Markets gone silent. Perhaps the most haunting change was the market square. Where once every stall overflowed baskets of apples and pears, bolts of cloth dyed with bright colors, fish still glistening from the river, cheeses ripened in straw, and now the stalls stood empty, shutters nailed shut, awnings sagging with dust. The market was the beating heart of the city. Without it, neighbors did not meet, voices did not rise in bargaining, and festivals lost their stage. Instead, food was delivered in ration measures, passed from gloved hand to gloved hand. The joy of daily commerce, so ordinary once, so essential to the community, vanished overnight. The plague doctor, passing through the deserted square, would hear only the creak of a sign swinging in the wind. The emptiness was a wound in stone and timber, a reminder that even survival was now stripped of fellowship. Patrols in the streets. Not only did the city seal itself from without, it sealed itself from within. Patrols moved through the narrow alleys, lanterns swaying, eyes sharp for any who defied the rules. The rules were many. No gathering at the taverns. No congregating at churches except in the smallest numbers. No visiting houses where sickness had been declared. No funerals beyond the simplest, most hurried burials. Men who once carried trade goods now carried staff of authority, ensuring that no door was opened when it ought to be closed. Families who disobeyed faced fines, or worse, imprisonment in their own pest houses, entire homes marked and sealed as though cursed. To the doctor, moving from house to house, the patrols were both guardians and burdens. They cleared his path, but they also reminded him that he walked a prison city, where every citizen was both captive and suspect. Homes sealed with chalk and board. One of the cruelest sights in a quarantined city was the sealing of homes. When plague entered a household, the door was marked sometimes with chalk, sometimes with paint, sometimes with a nailed board across the entrance. Inside, families were trapped. Some were sick, coughing and fevered. Others were healthy, yet confined to share the fate of the doomed. Neighbors passed them food through windows, but they were cut off from touch, from community, from escape. Children pressed their faces to the glass, looking out at a street they could not walk upon. Mothers wept silently at the loss of freedom. Fathers hammered on shutters, begging to be let out. And all the while, the doctor was one of the few permitted to cross the threshold. He entered those homes like a shadow, bringing what comfort he could, knowing that the chalk mark on the door was both a warning and a death sentence. The smell of quarantine. Every quarantined city carried its own atmosphere, a smell that clung to the air. Smoke from constant fires, meant to purify. Vinegar splashed on doorsteps. Herbs burning in pans along the streets. The stench of unwashed bodies confined too long together. And beneath it all, the unmistakable scent of sickness itself. To walk through the city was to breathe fear. To pass through its lanes was to feel the weight of absence, of doors unopened, of windows shuttered against both plague and hope. The doctor's mask, stuffed with strong herbs, dulled these odors. Yet he could not block out the silence, nor the way every echo seemed to linger too long. Ships idle in the harbor. If the city had a port, the quarantine extended to the sea. Ships lay at anchor, their sails furled, crews forbidden to set foot on land. For 40 days 40 giorni waited, the very number from which quarantine took its name. Sailors leaned over rails, staring at a shore they could not reach. Goods spoiled in the holds. Letters went undelivered. Sometimes entire crews sickened and died before the waiting ended, their ships floating as ghostly coffins in the bay. On the shore, townsfolk watched them with unease. Every mast was both a promise of trade and a threat of contagion. The sea itself, once a highway of wealth, had become a mote of suspicion. The sound of bells. If there was one sound that pierced quarantine's silence, it was the tolling of bells. They rang not for weddings, not for festivals, but for the dead. Each ring was a reminder that the plague was still within. And yet, bells also marked the rhythm of life, the hour of curfew, the call to prayers said privately, the signal of patrols changing watch. To children, the bells became part of the new world, a world where days blurred together, measured not by play or learning, but by the count of the dead. Fear of the stranger. Quarantine bred suspicion. Every stranger was a possible carrier, every neighbor a possible danger. Those who coughed were avoided, those who traveled were distrusted. Families drew inward, closing shutters, limiting touch even among kin. The plague doctor, masked and cloaked, was both the most feared stranger and the most needed visitor. People shrank from him in the street, yet begged for his presence at their doors. This paradox defined quarantine, isolation for survival, and yet dependence on the very few who crossed thresholds. Nightfall in the quarantined city. When night fell, the stillness deepened. No taverns spilled light into alleys. No laughter drifted from the courtyards. Only the watchmen's lanterns bobbed along the walls, only the dogs barked at shadows. The plague doctor's steps echoed louder in the hush. His visits by moonlight seemed even more spectral, as if he were not man but apparition. Behind every shutter, families listened for his staff's tap upon the stones, dreading that he might stop before their door. For in quarantine, the greatest terror was not war or fire or crime. It was silent. The silence of a city waiting, day after day, for a death it could not escape. Closing the chapter. The city in quarantine was more than a place, it was a condition of the soul. It was the weight of doors barred, the emptiness of markets, the suspicion of neighbors, the constant toll of bells. It was a city that had ceased to live in order to avoid dying, and in doing so, felt death all around it. The plague doctor, moving through those still streets, bore witness to the transformation. He saw what it meant for human life to halt, for communities to shrink to the size of a single household, for freedom to be surrendered in the name of survival. And yet, even in that silence, even in that prison of stone and fear, he carried on. For the work of the plague doctor was not just in healing bodies. It was moving, step by step, through the stillness of a city that held its breath. The end of the plague doctor. The end did not come suddenly. The plague doctor did not vanish one morning, leaving his mask and cloak folded neatly on a chair. He did not march away in ceremony, nor was he dismissed with thanks and applause. Instead, the figure that had haunted Europe's cities for centuries faded, step by step, into the background of history until what remained was not the man, but the image. It was a strange kind of departure, a dissolution rather than a conclusion. For the plague doctor was born of necessity, a role shaped by terror and survival. And when the terror receded, when survival no longer called for his presence, the doctor's shadow began to dissolve. The waning of the plague. The 17th century had been the height of his presence, the terrible Black Death before it, then wave after wave that returned across Europe's cities. But as medicine crept forward, as theories of contagion sharpened, as public health measures became stronger, the plague began to loosen its grip. Quarantines became more effective, sanitation more organized, ships inspected with greater care. The outbreaks that once claimed half a city began, little by little, to lose their edge. Fewer deaths, fewer waves, fewer years when the word pestilence struck like a hammer upon the soul. The doctor still walked the streets in his long cloak and beaked mask, but less often, and in fewer cities. The people looked at him with the same mixture of dread and hope, yet now he was less familiar, more of an oddity when he appeared. The plague was not gone yet. But its visits were rarer, its destruction less overwhelming. And with each year of respite, the figure who had once been indispensable became less needed. The mask removed. For generations, the plague doctor's mask had been one of Europe's most striking sights, that long beak, those dark glass eyes, the silhouette against a shuttered street. Children fled from it. Adults bowed before it. The sight was woven into the collective memory of entire nations. And yet, as the 18th century dawned, the mask began to disappear. It was heavy, impractical, and born of a theory that no longer seemed so certain. The idea of miasma-poisoned air was giving way to more subtle notions of contagion. The beak stuffed with herbs no longer reassured people as it once had. Doctors who continued their work did so in simpler garb, cloaks against infection, gloves for safety, masks less theatrical, more functional. Slowly, the bird-like visage became less common, until it appeared only in the rarest of places. Those who remembered its full power did so with a shiver, but the children born in later years grew up without ever seeing it in the streets. The last contracts. The plague doctor had never been an ordinary physician. He was bound by contracts, hired by towns or districts during times of outbreak, given terms that set his pay, his duties, even the promise of burial should he die. These contracts were both a safeguard and a grim reminder. His work was temporary, tied to crisis, his presence a measure of fear itself. As plague receded, so too did these contracts. Fewer towns needed such figures. Fewer councils were willing to pay. The profession, if it could be called that, dwindled. Men who might once have donned the mask chose other paths in medicine, or abandoned it altogether. The last plague doctors were not renowned healers. They were often men of lesser training, called in desperation when outbreaks flared in isolated towns. But their numbers were few, and their legacy was already fading. The shadow in memory. What remained was the memory. And memory is a strange soil. It does not preserve as a stone does, exact and cold. It grows, it transforms, it distorts. To those who had lived through the worst years, the plague doctor was a figure of horror, the specter that arrived at the door when death was already near. His staff upon the cobbles meant despair. His shadow across the window meant the household was marked. To others, he was a symbol of protection, the one who dared enter the sealed house, the one who tended the sick when neighbors fled, the one who endured what no one else would. And to children, remembering in scraps and whispers, he became almost a monster of folklore, the bird-headed figure that stalked the night, a bogeyman woven into nursery tales. By the 18th century, he belonged more to imagination than to fact. Few saw him in reality. Many saw him in dreams. The artist's touch. It was artists who ensured that he would not vanish altogether. Woodcuts, sketches, satirical prints all captured his strange silhouette. Some showed him solemn, walking through streets heavy with death. Others mocked him, turning his mask into a caricature, exaggerating the beak, the hollow eyes. These images spread farther than the man himself. Towns that had never seen a plague doctor in the flesh came to know his figure through drawings. And so, even as the profession faded, the image grew stronger, carried not by reality but by art. Later centuries, looking back, would seize upon these depictions. The plague doctor became almost more vivid in memory than he had ever been in life. A figure of carnival. Strangely, the end of the plague doctor did not consign him only to fear. In Venice, where plague had left deep scars, his mask found a second life not in the sickroom, but in the carnival. The long beak, once stuffed with herbs against poisoned air, was now painted and adorned, worn as a costume, a jest, a symbol not of terror but of play. Masqueraders donned the plague doctor's face to dance, to laugh, to revel in anonymity. This transformation was startling. A mask once synonymous with death became an ornament of celebration. Yet perhaps there was wisdom in it, a way for people to claim mastery over fear, to turn the figure that haunted them into one they could laugh at, even embrace. The plague doctor, once a grim sentinel, became a mask of theater. And in that way, he lived on. The quiet burial of a profession. By the 19th century, the plague itself had all but disappeared from Europe. Other diseases rose in its place: cholera, typhus, influenza, but the old pestilence had loosened its grip. The profession that had grown in its shadow was gone. There was no grave for the plague doctor. No monument. No ceremony to mark the end of his service. He simply slipped away, absorbed into history, remembered only in stories, in pictures, in the faint echo of footsteps across cobbled streets. Yet his absence was felt, in a strange way. Cities that once had lived in dread now lived in relief, but also with a strange emptiness, as though the familiar specter was gone, leaving them oddly exposed. The end that was not an end. And so, the plague doctor did not truly end. He changed. He shifted. He moved from flesh to story, from street to stage, from necessity to symbol. He became the dark angel of pandemics, the emblem of human struggle against the unseen. He was death's herald, and yet also resilience's witness. He was both feared and remembered, mocked and revered. Even today, centuries later, when the world speaks of plague, the image that rises is not of statistics or records, not of ships idle in harbors, not of quarantines imposed, but of the figure in the mask. The long beak, the cloak, the staff. The strange doctor who walked where none dared walk. Closing the chronicle. So the end of the plague doctor is not an end at all, but a transformation. His work ceased, his mask was set aside, his contracts dissolved. But in doing so, he crossed into something more enduring than profession. He became a myth. He lingers in art, in carnival, in history books, in nightmares. He lingers in every thought of pandemic, every whisper of disease that threatens to return. He lingers as a reminder of fear, of fragility, of resilience, of humanity's strange ways of facing the unfaceable. The plague doctor's footsteps no longer echo in the streets of Europe. But they echo in the corridors of memory. And memory does not forget. A farewell in shadows and silence. There are stories that end with triumph, and others that end with defeat. But the story of the plague doctor ends with something quieter, harder to name. It ends with the slow dimming of a figure that once walked in the brightest glare of fear, until he was no longer flesh and cloth but memory, symbol, dream. And in that fading, there is a strange beauty. For the plague doctor was never just a man. He was a mirror, held up to the world in its darkest hours, reflecting back its terror, its compassion, its endurance. Now, in the stillness of hindsight, we can step back and look at him whole. We can gather the fragments, the beaked mask, the gloved hands, the staff tapping against deserted streets, the contract signed in shaky ink, the weary heart behind the disguise. We can see not only what he was but what he meant. The shape of a shadow. He was born of desperation, stitched together by fear and necessity. Cities needed him, not because they loved him, but because without him there was no one willing to face the sickness head-on. His very presence was a confession: we cannot save ourselves, and so we must summon a figure to carry our dread for us. The mask gave him form. The cloak gave him weight. The herbs, the staff, the gloves, the rituals, all these were less about healing than about containment, about giving shape to the shapeless terror. He was, in many ways, a shadow with hands. A silhouette made solid. And yet, within that shadow, a man still lived. A man who woke in the morning and fastened the buttons of his cloak with hands that trembled. A man who knelt at the bedside of the dying, breathing through cloth and herbs, wondering if his own life was slipping away in those moments. A man who carried not only tools of medicine, but the burden of being hope itself in a city gone silent. The weight of a role. The daily routines told one part of the story: the mask donned at dawn, the staff held like a wand of authority, the endless trudging through streets emptied of laughter. But the heart of the role lay not in these gestures, but in the eyes that watched him. For the sick, he was both a beacon and a warning. To families, he was the sign that the plague had entered their door. To children, he was a specter, half man, half phantom. To the church, he was a strange instrument of providence, allowed to touch what priests could only bless. He bore this weight without complaint, because complaint was useless. He was contracted, hired, bound. His pay was uncertain, his life more uncertain still. But in shouldering this role, he became more than himself. He became a vessel for the fears of all who looked at him. And perhaps this was the greatest cost of his profession, not the disease that ate at his body, but the burden of being the figure that carried fear itself. The sound of silence. At night, when the streets were emptied and the bells had told their grim counts of the dead, the plague doctor's solitude deepened. He sat alone in a chamber, removing the mask, letting his skin breathe air thick with smoke and fumigation. He washed his hands in vinegar, rubbed his temples, and sometimes wept. In those hours, the mask lay upon the table like an abandoned face. And he stared at it, wondering if the people outside had begun to think of him as that mask, not a man, but a shape. It was in those moments of silence that the plague doctor revealed his truest self, not the figure of authority, but the man of fragility. A man who feared his own cough, who thought of his family far away, who prayed in whispers that he would live to see another dawn. The city slept uneasily around him, a city in quarantine, a city of shuttered doors and fevered dreams. And within that silence, his own heart became a drum, keeping the rhythm of survival. The children's eyes. Perhaps nothing captured his paradox more than the children. For children saw with unfiltered truth. Some shrank away, clutching at their mother's skirts, unable to bear the sight of the mask. Others peered with curiosity, daring to inch closer, fascinated by the long beak, the dark lenses. To them, he was both monster and magician, terror and marvel in one. And when they sickened as so many did, he became their last visitor. The figure in black who bent down, his eyes hidden, his voice muffled. Did they know he meant to help them? Or did they think that death itself had come in disguise? The children gave the plague doctor a strange immortality. For even when adults tried to forget, the children remembered. And they whispered his image into stories that traveled across generations, reshaping him from doctor into legend. The tools and the faith. He carried instruments, knives, probes, jars of ointment, pouches of herbs. Each was an attempt at hope, a ward against despair. And yet each was also a symbol, a ritual to comfort more than to cure. The church, too, lent him its shadow. He was not a priest, and yet he was not free of holy expectation. Crosses were raised in his presence. Bells tolled to accompany his work. He was a man of medicine, but he walked in a world where medicine and faith blurred, where fumigations and prayers were part of the same desperate tapestry. He was both a servant of the body and an unwilling servant of the soul. A liminal figure, standing between science unborn and faith unyielding. The city he walked. Through him, the city itself took on new form. Quarantined, sealed, patrolled, silenced, the streets became corridors of echo, the houses tombs of waiting. His footsteps became part of that architecture. The sound of his staff on the cobbles was as much a feature of plague time as the boarded markets, the shuttered churches, the deserted squares. And when the plague passed, the city changed again. Gates reopened, markets filled, bells rang with joy. But something in the stones remembered. For every street that had once echoed with his steps seemed forever touched by the memory of his shadow. The fading and the afterlife. When the plague itself receded, he receded too. His mask was laid aside, his contracts left unsigned, his presence no longer called for. And yet, the image remained. In woodcuts, in prints, in carnival masks, in whispered stories he lived on. He transformed into a symbol, into an archetype, into a myth. He was mocked, feared, celebrated, remembered. He was woven into the tapestry of European memory, not as a man, but as an emblem. The end of the plague doctor was not an end. It was a metamorphosis. The whisper that remains. Now, centuries later, when pandemics are spoken of, when fear rises again in the air, the image that surfaces is still his. Not the statistics, not the ships idle in harbors, not the quarantines or the physicians of later centuries, but the mask. The beak. The cloak. He has become eternal in this way. Not in life, not in flesh, but in symbol. Eternal as a whisper of humanity's fear and its endurance. A dreamlike farewell. And so we close his chronicle not with the clang of a bell, nor the shout of a watchman, nor the cry of the sick. We close it with silence. We see him one last time, stepping down an empty street. His mask gleams faintly in the dusk. His staff touches the cobblestones with a rhythm that feels like a heartbeat. He pauses at a corner, turns his head as though listening to the future that will forget him. And then he walks on, into the dimming light, until the mist swallows him. The plague doctor is gone. But his shadow remains. And in that shadow, we remember not only death but the fragile, enduring courage of those who stood against it.